Hey guys, it's Mario here, back with another in-depth interview. And this time we're going to go into the topic of how do you move from being an intermediate to a more advanced athlete? Basically, how do you get out of that, what I like to call the intermediate purgatory, where you're kind of spinning your wheels and you're not sure how to progress from, let's say, getting those newbie gains to taking that to the next level. And today I have a special guest here who was kind to join me. His name is Eric Helms, well known in the field of evidence-based fitness nutrition, published researcher, physique athlete himself, powerlifter, Olympic weightlifter, and all these other kinds of things. Maybe the side gig, probably in Captain America during the night. Welcome, Eric. Can you let the audience know a little bit what are you up to aside from being Captain America? That's a different interview.
Well, thank you for having me. Honored to be here. Yeah, just to get everyone up to speed with who I am, what I do. I just got into the game, just like everybody else, just lifting weights and enjoying it. Being obsessed with being as big and strong as possible, and reading crappy muscle mags and doing dumb things. And found I got just as interested into the science and the practice and the philosophy behind, bodybuilding, powerlifting, and strength training in general. Um, yeah, I've been lifting now for a little over 12 years and do moderately mediocre in powerlifting and bodybuilding. And started a coaching business along with my colleagues, Alberto Nunez, Brad Loomis, Jeff Alberts, and we recently added on Andrea Valdez as our fifth coach for 3DMJ, where we work with drug-free strength and physique athletes. And I'm kind of like the science arm of 3DMJ. I make sure our continuing education is up to speed. I'm currently doing my PhD at AUT, Auckland University of Technology, which has a very strong sports science and strength and conditioning department, looking at autoregulation in strength training. And I have a couple master's degrees, one where I looked at macronutrient and protein manipulation and dieting strength athletes, and another one that I did in the States on exercise science. So that's kind of me. I'm an active researcher. I publish, I travel, I speak, and I lift heavy things. It's kind of what I do.
Awesome. Yeah, last time we spoke was at the AFPT, and that video is also going to be linked in the description below. We talked about how to lose a lot of weight fast. That video is very famous, and of course, we want to follow that up. And now I wanted to bring you on more to talk about training and nutrition from a different aspect. And we covered a little bit for beginners, of course, how to lose a lot of weight fast. That might be very interesting. Well, let's talk a bit about more kind of intermediate athletes. And I want to create a context here before we spit out any information. Of course, we have to create good context. So, who is this interview for? Who should pay the most attention to what we're saying here? Um, a lot of guys, and Eric probably noticed himself, that you get through your newbie gains phase, which is, let's say, for most guys, a year of training. You gain those 25 pounds of muscle, and the progress kind of goes very slow from there or stops entirely. And most guys don't manage to break through that phase and make significant gains afterwards. So we're talking about people being stuck at, I don't know, 160-pound bench, and they're probably should be lifting a little bit more with their years of experience. And it's usually accompanied by kind of a never-ending pursuit of staying lean as possible and never making any gains on the bar, and kind of those cycles, 6 week dieting, 2 weeks kind of repeating, binging, getting back into that. In a nutshell, the weight on the bar isn't going up. So how do you start from there? And with Eric, I want to ask you three questions here, I guess three angles in this. And first, we're going to go into training. That's the most important, at least for what I can see, a lot of people struggling with. So someone realizes they can't add weight to the bar anymore. And it doesn't happen on a workout-to-workout basis, not even on a week-to-week basis, and they can't hit the target reps. Where do you go from there? Like, what is necessary now to move on to the next level?
Well, obviously, like you said, the context is so important, and it's possible that the person is already doing a very, very high level of volume. But assuming they have a more or less appropriate beginner approach as their program, which is not high in volume, and they've kind of milked that for what it's worth. The next step is to basically do more. Um, what often happens, though, is that the program structure stays the same, and they just work as hard as possible within the constraints of that program. So they're, training to failure and training their 3 or 4 days a week, maybe more if they're doing a different type of split, and expecting to see the same kind of progress they saw previously. I think while training is very important, I think more than anything, the mindset, acceptance, and then moving on is the most important part of progressing after someone's a beginner. Um, because what often will happen is that people will have a logical understanding they need to do something different, and take a more patient approach. Um, but they keep emotionally returning to what netted them those first, 20 pounds of muscle and, almost doubling of their strength that they experienced in their first 6 months of training or so, which is a wonderful time, and it's easy to get nostalgic about it. And I did myself. But whatever you did your first 6 months, it was going to work regardless. And I think that's something everyone needs to realize. That wasn't a magic program. You were just in a fantastic position to make progress. So anyway, to get to what you would do with training, first is accepting the fact that you might need to progress at a slower rate, and then set your training up around that. So if you were doing a appropriate amount of volume, that means you're going to need to find a way to do more, and then also allow yourself better recovery. So if you're coming from a low volume, moderate frequency or high frequency approach with extremely high intensity because you've kind of milked it for what it's worth, you're hitting failure all the time, essentially increasing your frequency, and allowing volume to spill into more days, and then lowering intensity, and then having a progression plan instead of just going, right, I'm going to try to add weight to the bar every time I come in the gym, is the next step. So this is where you have to become a little bit of a student of the sport. It doesn't mean it has to be that complicated. Some of my go-to progression plans for the intermediate is just to take 3 weeks of kind of a linear progression. And when I say linear, I actually mean in terms of like linear periodization, which I'll talk about in a second. Deload and then repeat slightly heavier. So this could be something as simple as choosing a rep range and then letting the reps decrease as you increase weight on the bar. So you might go, let's say 8 to 12 if your goal is hypertrophy. So week 1, you do 3 by 12. Week 2 is 3 by 8. Week 3 is 3 by 10. Week 3 is 3 by 8. And then the deload, you would just drop off a set and do 2 by 8. And each week you'd increase the load, a small amount, the smallest amount you can put on the bar without micro loading. And then after the deload, you'd start that process over again, except heavier than the first week. So whatever you did for 3 by 12, you'd do 3 by 12 again, but again, a small increment in load. And that adds up really quickly. That's like adding, 5 pounds to your compound lift or your whatever lift you're talking about every 5th week. That's like 10 load increases per year. That would be adding 50 pounds to your, say, 12 rep near max, if it worked for the whole year, which it may or may not. But that kind of approach of just playing chess a little more and playing checkers less is a good way of trying to look beyond just the next week of training in the gym, which is where most beginners moving into the intermediate stage, or trying to move out of the intermediate stage, tend to get tripped up, at least on the training side.
Absolutely. And what you said there is really good because a lot of, let's say, the beginner mindset is working on, okay, workout to workout. What do I need to do next Monday? I'm going to hit chest again. Am I going to increase the bench for like, let's say 10 pounds or 5 pounds or whatever your increment in the gym is? And the basic scheme that you introduced there is quite simple. And I'm going to actually write it in the description below for you guys so you can kind of follow it through. And the deload there is critical, right? Because it allows that fatigue to dissipate a little bit, so then you can move into another cycle with a little bit heavier weight, right? That's critical, but because a lot of guys I know, they would try to skip the deload, and that's was my mistake as well when I first started out. And why would you say that deload is there a little bit necessary? Because I know a lot of people will be inclined to skip it, like and know.
They would, and they'd probably be fine for a while. But again, if you were at a place where what you're currently doing, you're not progressing and you're stuck in beginner intermediate hell, or purgatory, as you were saying, which feels like hell sometimes when you can't progress. Maybe it's time to not let your ego take over anymore.
Exactly.
And also it's time to acknowledge that maybe you don't quite yet have a good intuition with where your recovery status is, or you'd be progressing. If anyone is familiar with Mike Zourdos, he is a very, very high level power lifter, stronger than most of us could ever hope to be, even if we took like every supplement, all the drugs in the world, and had great genetics. We still wouldn't be as strong as him, and he's drug free. He's amazing. Um, he's an extremely intelligent coach and lifter, and he has developed a system of auto regulation. And the reason he developed it is because he found from interviewing high level athletes and coaches that it takes like 10 years to really develop a very solid sense of intuition and knowing your body and knowing yourself and knowing how to progress. I'm not saying that's for everyone, but it doesn't come overnight to know kind of how to train intuitively. So why you would expect to be able to do that when you're stuck in your first year of training or so, and know when you are over or under recovered is you probably don't know. So having a regular deload schedule is a good way to kind of save yourself from yourself and ensure that even if you get a little over recovered, that's fine. You're going into your next block with heavier weights. You'll just be very ready for it. I think a better way to think of that deload at the end of the week is more of an intro week to the next cycle where you're going to be going heavier, where you want to be fresh going into that new day of 3x12 with the heavier weights than you've ever done before, which is going to be challenging.
And let's say someone, life is definitely going to throw stuff at people, and as we go through that, how big of a deal is, let's say someone extends another week of going heavy and then takes the deload, or takes the deload earlier because they had a holiday or something like that? Because of course life will happen, and maybe time those deloads on a time when you actually have less time to train. Would that be something to help increase adherence and consistency with the program as well?
Certainly, you have to always let life happen first, and when you try to ignore life and just schedule training, that ends up becoming frustrating and stressful to one aspect of your life, whether that's training or whatever you've neglected. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with just doing your workouts in order and not worrying about if you had to take an extra off day. And if you
Yeah,
finished a quote unquote 4-week cycle in 4.5 weeks, who cares?
yeah, exactly.
Doesn't
Your body doesn't know it's Monday or Sunday or whatever it is, right? It's
exactly.
depending on a continuum of training. One fact there that I want to bring back a little bit is that there's, I guess there's an intuition where you would eventually develop, or with a coach or yourself, where you know when you're doing too much volume or when you're doing too little volume. So both are equally, I guess, can negatively affect your progress. How would you look for signs? What are some of the signs that you're not doing enough, or that you're doing just too much, just killing yourself?
It's a good question, and I think this is something that a lot of people have tried to tackle and answer. And from a researcher perspective, it's interesting. One of the biggest struggles out there is finding good measures that reflect training load and determine whether the external load, the amount of actual work you're doing, matches the internal load, the amount of work you're experiencing, right? Um, and to this day, even though we have salivary measures of hormones, we have things like quote unquote neuromuscular testing, whether that's jumping on a force plate or doing some type of reflex test, or whether it is taking heart rate variance, the actual time between your beats and how much variation there is in that in your heart, or whether that is doing all kinds of other actual physiological testing. The most reliable measures are psychological. And they're not that reliable. They're just more reliable. So yeah, it's a tough one. I don't, and performance, of course, is also very good. But the thing you have to realize is that just because you're doing a ton of volume doesn't necessarily mean that your force production on a given day will be down. So this is one of those difficult things where we try to find tests to reflect your performance. Is that while you may be very tired on a given day, we've all had those days where we've come in feeling wrecked, didn't get a lot of sleep, and somehow we managed to actually crush the weights. Um, so for whatever reason, the component of our body that allows us in our mind to actually push heavy weight may or may not be affected by that. So anyway, there are a couple ways in my mind to do this, and some things that I've seen as a coach that aren't in the literature. So one is that right off face value, if you're stuck, if you're not progressing, typically and that's consistent, not just I missed 1 week progress. Remember, if we're thinking like an intermediate or advanced lifter now, we need to think, okay, I did a 4 to 8 week block, tested my lifts, and I still didn't make any progress. Then you need to assess, okay, did I do enough volume or not? And it could be either. Either you pushed yourself and you were so fatigued that it was bleeding into your testing. Uh, it could have been something acute, like you needed a more aggressive taper or deload before testing to realize your gains and not be in a fatigued state. Or it could be that just the volume is way too much for your current training age and work capacity across the board. Um, those are things are relatively easy to feel. If you went into testing feeling wrecked, if you felt wrecked for the vast majority of your training, if your training motivation was starting to go down, that's one of the things that often correlates with overreaching and overtraining is training motivation goes down. Sleep quality can get messed up. General sense of being annoyed and being off can be there with doing too much volume. Another thing that I noticed, and this is not in the literature, is that the variance of performance. So for example, there was a period I'm recalling in my own training where I was really trying to push deadlifts, which for me create a lot of fatigue. And there was one day where I was able to deadlift, I think 230 for 3, which is, I want to say 517 or something like that, pounds. And then literally a week later, I was going to try to do 232 and a half for 3. And on my warm-ups, I pulled 210 for a single, and it was a 10 RPE. And it felt like a 1 rep max. So all of a sudden in a week, I'd lost like 30 kilos off my max. So it wasn't just, oh, I couldn't hit my target. It was, I had wildly varying performance. And some lifts are express that more obviously. But if you find that you're just generally not you can't train very very effectively, that may be I'm just not progressing. That could be not enough volume, or that could be just an acute issue of you need to do a more aggressive taper before you test. But if you're finding that your performance is all over the place and you're feeling the effects of fatigue, that probably surely is a sign of doing more volume than you're currently can handle. On the other side of it, if you feel fine and you're just doing your program, and yeah, there's spots where it's hard, but you don't really feel like you're pushing yourself and you don't progress, and you aren't opposed to the idea, except for scheduling, of adding more volume or more days or trying to get an additional training in, then you're probably not doing enough.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good there because what I'm assuming, let's say someone follows the, let's say, progression scheme, basic sample progression scheme that you mentioned, they dropping the reps, they're adding the weight, then comes week 5, and let's say they did 100 kilos, 105, 110, and they try to now do 105 for 12, because let's just assume that, and they hit 7, right? It's kind of completely off track, and something there might have been acutely wrong with that session. So would you try to verify the result again with another session, or would you try to see, okay, maybe I just done too much volume to begin with, or I'm simply not adapted, so I need to repeat the same cycle as before and let my body adapt to the new way I'm progressing. So obviously, it takes some time if you're switching to this from just a bro split, which is something that just randomly picking exercise and volume, of course.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Is that the first time you see performance not going well, even in like that example you gave of 5 weeks later, it's probably not enough to hang your hat on. That could have just been you didn't get good sleep last night, or you got out of position on that 4th and 5th rep. Um, especially if you're semi-intermediate and beginner, and it's a hard lift. So yeah, I would wait until things don't go right twice to confirm it.
Yeah, but you
Um,
know that, I mean, beginners in general, the issues are not just the actual strength of the person, it's also coordination, it's also how do you express your, let's say, motor units contracting together at the same time, and all these other things that are happening. So it's more a technical issue. At the same time, could be because you're missed the lift, not just because you're not strong at the point where you can make the lift. So there's a lot of things play. Maybe you got a message on your Facebook, you just checked it right before the lift, you start doing the lift, you're thinking about the message, bam, you just missed the lift for no reason, and then you kind of screwed your progression scheme, right? While in
mm,
reality, you might have just needed to repeat it again. One interesting question that I actually got on this as well is that how often do we need to vary rep range and exercises. Let's talk with exercise first, and we can go into rep ranges. As someone who is in that intermediate stage, or let's say as a beginner, the most common advice you're going to read is, okay, you need to vary every 2-3 weeks, right? You need to keep your body guessing, confuse the muscle, confuse this or that. When one lift stops working, just switch the lift. It's the lift, it's not the actual periodization that is happening.
Mm.
So that's an often common question that I'm getting a lot. So I just wanted you to touch on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing I like to point out is that maybe the people who experience success with a lot of lift variation at a high level, it's not just because of that. Something else is going on. And I'll use some evidence to back that up. We have certain systems of weightlifting and powerlifting where they're highly specialized, where all you do is snatch and clean and jerk and maybe back squat and maybe overhead press, maybe, or a push press. And that's pretty much it, always. And then systems in powerlifting where you only do the big three, always. Bulgarian systems come to mind. Some of the trends these days with highly specific training and powerlifting come to mind. And these people are competing at an extremely high level. Then you also have people who follow, let's say West Side Barbell, where they're changing out and using bands and chains lifts on a 2 to 3 week rotational basis, also competing at a very high level. So I think the thing we have to realize is that when something like that happens, it means that variable is actually not the key critical component. Or if it was, one of those two groups wouldn't do well, right? Now that said, it doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that it is something you can manipulate. And there is a good study out there where they compared one group doing only Smith machine squats and having a constant load and just trying to go to failure and doing more volume with the Smith machine squats, more sets per week, to another group that was doing Smith machine squats, deadlift, lunge, and I believe one other lower body exercise that I can't remember. But basically, it was 4 exercises or one, and then there was basically 4 groups, a version of each one of those 2 exercise variations, with either doing constant loading, just going to failure, or varying their load. And they found that varying the load was better, and then the group doing 4 exercises was better than the group doing just one. So obviously, if you did only one exercise for your entire lower body, that probably would not produce the same level of strength or hypertrophy as doing a reasonable amount. Even the most strict power lifter or Olympic lifter is still doing at least 2 lower body exercises. So yeah, it's no surprise that a non-technical lift like a Smith machine squat, doing it only by itself would be counterproductive.
How much is too much? How much is too much variation? Because we see guys, walk into the gym and do 8 exercises for chest on Monday.
Yeah. I'll get right to that. Yeah. So the question is, where's the sweet spot? And it depends on your goals. If your goal is strength, obviously a large percentage of your volume you want to be on the movement that you're trying to get good at, because strength isn't just an attribute of your body, it's a skill. So a power lifter is not just trying to get his quads, his hamstrings, and his glutes and his lower back stronger to squat. He's trying to get very good at squatting. So not only does he need to get all of the various parts stronger, but he needs to get the squat skill as good as possible. So for a power lifter, you need to think of, okay, what are the links in the chain that all make up this movement? I need to obviously train the movement to get very, very good at it. And then I do need to have some consideration of the links in the chain, because my individual biomechanics or even my joint health may not be ideally matched with just doing the main movement. Use myself as an example for kind of talking about the too little variation as just a power lifter, if we kind of ignore the fact that I'm also a bodybuilder. If I just do a high volume, low bar back squat to depth program, I end up getting a great deal of hip pain and tearing my labrum, which I've already done. That's been tested because I don't have the greatest hips for my sport, right? However, I can front squat as much as I want. I can box squat to a block. I can, above depth to a box. I can do other variations and get hypertrophy and coordination in my legs and do similar movements that don't have perfect transfer, but they have good transfer and don't beat up my hip. And then squat with the amount necessary to improve as a good way to, kind of fill that gap. And that can be true of whether you do close grip benching because you have shoulder issues, Whether you find you need to do close grip benching just because you don't get very even development. Maybe you have really long arms or really short arms, so you need some way to either emphasize or de-emphasize the triceps. Um, so for powerlifters, that's kind of the way to look at it, is that maybe if you perfectly are built for squatting or benching, you can just do heaps of benching and squat. And that's typically what you see very high-level powerlifters do. And then they don't understand why other people have trouble or get banged up when they do it. Now, on the other side of it, for a bodybuilder, you do want some more variety because you're not just trying to get good at these movements. You're using the movements to get bigger muscles. And your muscles attach in all kinds of cool ways, have multiple compartments. They transmit force laterally. If you actually start learning about skeletal muscle morphology, it's much more complex than simply an attachment from the origin to the insertion. And there is preferential motor unit recruitment sometimes, depending on intensity or speed of contraction. There's all kinds of nifty stuff when you really dig into advanced level muscle physiology, which would indicate to you, hey, maybe I should be varying my things a little bit. Now, unfortunately, a lot of bodybuilders tend to take things to extremes, and you see them, like you said, doing 8 different chest exercises. I think this is as simple as doing a horizontal press, a horizontal pull, a vertical push, a vertical pull, and then looking at your weak points for your upper body and adding in a little bit more. Maybe you need to do some more incline work if you find the clavicular head of your pec is not doing great. I haven't seen that be extremely successful, but at least it makes sense logically. If your delts are lagging, you throw in some lateral raises or rear delt flies, that kind of thing. And I think you have basically a core group of primary exercises that you use as your metrics of progress, and then sprinkle in accessories based on your weak points and your needs for volume. So, for example, an upper body workout for a bodybuilder that is appropriate but not going overboard might be bench, overhead press, seal row, weighted chins, a bicep, a tricep, and then maybe a lateral raise or a rear delt fly, depending on their own individual development. That's a lot more minimalistic than most people would take on. And part of that is also because of it makes more sense to have a higher frequency of training and less volume per session to spread that stress out so that your overall recovery is better. And that means that, no, you don't need to do 8 chest exercises and 24 total sets only on one day, because you're not going to wait 7 days to train it again. You might be hitting that the day after tomorrow. If you're training upper body, let's say 2 to 3 times per week, those 24 sets, which isn't an unreasonable amount of volume, it's high but not unreasonable, that might be 2 days of doing 12 sets or 3 days of doing 8 sets instead of 1 day of doing 24 and having the last half of them not really have any benefit.
Yeah,
besides
exactly. Yeah, going through the motion.
Right,
That's
exactly.
that's what we see at the end of the workout. And a lot of guys, I mean, after you've been in the gym for, let's say, the first couple of exercises, especially with guys, which you're going to touch briefly upon here, is going to muscle failure. If you go to failure in the first exercise, that 5th exercise that you're doing that day, it's basically volume is so suboptimal that it's the diminishing return point, and that is just almost a waste of time, although you are getting some work done. And just a couple of your thoughts on going to muscular failure as a tool, and when is it appropriate to use muscular failure in your training?
Sure, yeah. So I think for some reason, failure is one of those topics that tends to bring out the black and white in people. And some people think, oh, well, training to failure is a very easy way to ensure that you have recruited all motor units possible and got the most out of that set. Um, and they're right, but that's a very short-sighted view, because like you said, let's say you are doing that upper body workout I prescribed where you've got, bench and overhead press and let's say a tricep pushdown. What are you going to expect is going to be happening with your loads on your second set of bench if you go to failure on your first one? And we actually have studies now that show that short rest periods and even going to failure reduces the total amount of volume. And there's a very strong connection between volume and hypertrophy over time. And we've seen longer rest period studies beat out shorter rest period studies. So that's been happened repeated times, actually, in terms of hypertrophy. And the hypothesis is there that the volume is the reason why, that when you have to reduce load and reduce reps, the tonnage goes down quite substantially. So anyway, yeah, going to failure is perfectly fine. You just have to realize that it is more work at a higher intensity. So it would logically have a slightly higher necessity for recovery. But more importantly, it can acutely affect your ability to perform. And you might, while that individual set gives you less of a stimulus, you might get more total stimulus over a day, over weeks, etc. So I like to tell people to try to use failure to their advantage. Um, so if you've got, let's say, bench, overhead press, and tricep pushdowns, maybe you're taking your last set of overhead press near to failure. But the goal isn't to go to failure. The goal should be to meet your progression scheme like we talked about before. If you're increasing
Exactly.
volume by, increasing your load over time and you're creating progressive tension overload, you're going to grow. And you don't want failure to interfere. And it's also worthwhile to point out that you get a lot of motor unit recruitment not going to failure and just training near to it or using semi-heavy loads. So if you're training anywhere from like say a 6 RPE or higher with moderate to moderately heavy loads, you're probably going to get some activation. I think there are a few studies showing like 80% of MVIC, like maximal contraction, gets pretty damn close to recruiting everything. It doesn't necessarily give it a training stimulus. Obviously, you have to do some volume with that 80% or higher, but 80% for most people is like an 8 RM. So
Yeah.
that means like if you do 1 rep and leave 7 reps in the tank, that's like an RPE of like 3. You still actually recruited everything for that rep. So you could probably technically, if you wanted to spend 5 hours in the gym, just do a whole bunch of singles with 80% and eventually accumulate the same volume that would have taken you in 1/10 of that time and get a similar training effect. So I think that is a useful way to think about it so that people understand they don't necessarily have to go to failure. The only time failure becomes a little more important is if you're doing a very, very low load training block, because then it's not going to have much of effectiveness until you get close to failure. If you're doing something like 40 to 60% of your 1 RM, which that's why I don't typically recommend bodybuilders spend much time training with those loads at all.
Hmm.
For the most part, we're talking like 15 RM and lighter loads, maybe 20 RM and heavier.
Hmm.
But anyway, yeah, getting a little off topic. Yeah, failure. You need to think about how it's going to affect not only the rest of the workout and the rest of the sets on that individual exercise, but subsequent days. Um, because really, if the guy did, if you're someone who did 100 kilos on squats for 10 reps, 7 reps, then 5 reps for a total of 22 reps, are you really doing a better job than the guy who did the same amount of weight for 9, 9, and 9 and got 27 reps? No. You might have worked harder, but you didn't work smarter, and you ended up getting less total work done.
Yeah, exactly. We're not just talking about squats. We're talking about, okay, let's follow that up with a leg extension. You're probably
Yep.
going to be able to do a lot less there and kind of accumulates over time. Where failure, just for those interested in implementing, I mean, you can always implement it just for isolation movements. If you're not sure how to do it, if you're kind of afraid to, let's say, fail on a bench or come close to failure, you can be a little bit conservative on compound lifts and be a little bit more, let's say, free with those isolation movements like a lateral raise, probably very little risk. Even if you go to failure, I mean, it's already kind of the end of the workout. The muscle will recover faster anyway, so you can probably train it a little bit faster as well. While let's say you go to failure on deadlifts, the risks go exponentially higher there if you come closer to failure. So if you're just interested for those guys who want to implement failure, um, one thing here is that a lot of people, I mean, we mentioned volume a lot, right? We talk about volume, and currently in the industry, from what I can see, there's a lot of proponents of, okay, what's the minimum amount that I need to do to just make some progress in terms of the weight in the bar, versus why don't I just add an extra set to get extra muscle growth, right? Why don't I just add a set instead of that progression scheme being, let's say, going from 100 for 12, 105 for 10, 110 for 8. Why don't I just add 100 and then I switch to 4 sets of 100, right? Why don't I just add that much volume all of a sudden? Why would that not be more effective? And then add even the 5th set and the 6th set and then deload, right? What's your thought on that? That's kind of different philosophies.
Well, yeah. I think either time you go to either extreme, you start to run into some issues that make you scratch your head and go, "That doesn't make any sense." And a good example is, okay, what if if more volume leads to better growth, then why don't I just add more volume? instead of trying to add weight to the bar. I'm not a power lifter. Um, yeah, but then you get to a point like you're doing 10 sets on
Yeah,
a single day, single exercise. So I think a useful, and it's not the only way to do it, a useful way of looking at it is that you add enough volume to see progress on the bar. And then you know that hypertrophy is a substantial component in trained lifters to strength. And there's some debate around that, but I don't think it's a well supported debate. People who think that they're not connected at all. Um, to then test whether or not you're progressing, you know, especially if you're getting stronger in the rep ranges you're training in. So yeah, in my mind, there's definitely times you're going to need to add volume, and that you will benefit from doing it. But trying to add volume too quickly can sometimes actually be suboptimal. If you look at the systematic review by Wernbaum, there was a bit of a bell curve there where trying to do too many sets and the actual rate of muscle growth started to slow down. It didn't go backwards. I think the actual point where you're doing so many sets to where you're actually like, you know, getting smaller or not growing at all is a silly amount. So that's why you see so many people with a ton of volume who are still making progress. Just like you see people who only do like one set every week for an exercise still making progress. But it's not optimal, and there are risks with doing extremely high volume. You know, training in a fatigue state is not great for injury risk. Um,
yeah,
and on the other side of it, just doing a minimalist approach is just sometimes unnecessarily conservative. And that will also prompt you towards, if you're so afraid of adding volume or you don't add volume, then you typically train at a higher and higher intensity. And with certain lifts and certain movements, that can also predispose you to injury risk. So I think a good way to look at it is that your progress should dictate when you need to add volume, not just the, well, I could do more and it might be better mentality.
exactly. Yeah, base it on data instead of how you feel. I think that's kind of what we're moving from beginner to intermediate in general, is that mindset of, okay, let's actually add some structure to this. Let's approach this in a systematic way versus just, oh, I feel like I'm going heavy today, right? It's more like,
Hmm.
okay, this is what I planned, this is what I'm going to execute, and it's kind of do the work mentality versus just, okay, I feel I'm going to go 25 reps to failure today for some reason, with no structure whatsoever. All right, so I want to move on a little bit to nutrition. I think with training, it's pretty clear. I'm going to leave some of your pyramid links in there. I mean, I'm sure you got some copyrights there from the pharaohs to promote pyramids. Hope they don't
Yeah,
mind.
I,
uh,
I, 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 I sued the crap out of Egypt. Yes, they're not happy with me. So yeah.
Moving on to nutrition, what would you advise to someone who is saying that they want to get lean? Of course, they want to get abs. That's the common goal, right? That's the standard. They want to be YouTube lean, and they don't want to track calories and macros. So they just say, "Okay, I don't want to do it." What would you advise to a person like
Well, first I'd probably ask them, so why aren't you lean right now? You know, like
that?
if it was so easy that you could just do whatever you want. But that said, there's probably there's a middle ground there. The first thing I would try to do is explain to them that tracking does not necessarily need to be a life sentence, and probably shouldn't be. And if they are willing to spend even 1 to 2 weeks tracking and being a little anal, they can learn a tremendous amount about their own food habits, when they decide to overeat, what things in their environment, their mental state, and their social circles leads them to overeating. When do they unconsciously eat, and how do they respond to days of overeating? Do they undereat the next day, or which most people do? And basically, what are the things they do that they're not aware of? And then also on the more kind of quantitative educational side of it, what are portion sizes? What are my macronutrient intakes? A lot of I used to think I was eating a way more protein than I was until I actually tracked when I was just getting started. What is my carbohydrate and fat ratios? Do I actually get in fruits and vegetables on a regular basis? And once you have kind of opened the door and seen the light on all of these things that you may or may not be doing the way you thought you were, then you can change it. There's that cliche saying, if you're not assessing, you're guessing. And I think that's true of nutrition as well. So even spending a 2 week period of tracking and then going, right, so I need to eat more protein. Um, I need to try to be more mindful when I go out to eat because I tend to clean my plate and it adds 1,000 calories I didn't think I was eating. Um, I need to make sure I have, a vegetable with dinner and fruit with breakfast, or I won't get enough for the day. And man, I really tend to undereat the day after I overeat. Maybe I can try to bring those a little closer to the midline. And then all of a sudden, you might find that you kind of settle at a slightly lower body fat. Um, or if you don't, then you can at least become more aware of portion sizes. And without tracking, you can start doing some habit-based things, like having a glass of water and a salad with dressing on the side and eating your protein first before you move on to the rest of your meal at every meal. You can try things out like intermittent fasting. You can try things out with meal schedules, or with emphasizing a different protein intake, of like upping your protein a lot to try to see if things that aren't strictly tracking result in you eating less. Chewing your food longer even can have an impact on that. Or consciously evaluating your level of fullness at each meal, and trying to be satisfied but not full all the time. Making different choices, getting sorbet instead of gelato, getting leaner cuts of food, doing all these types of things, getting dressing on the side, dipping your fork instead of putting it on it, without necessarily tracking everything. If you do all of those things, you may find that you settle at a lower range. The term set point implies that you've got the specific body fat percentage that you will defend, either going above or below it. But more accurately, we have kind of the settling point range. And our set point is depending on our behaviors and the way we were raised and the environment we live in and our job and all that stuff. We may even be above it in a modern society. But for most people who have a reasonable handle on things, it's somewhere in the middle of that range. And you can probably move to the low end of your set point with just behavior-related change. Now, if you want to get below that, and the reality is most people do, they don't have realistic expectations. They want to look like a model, and that's just for 99% of people not something they can maintain without having an unhealthy relationship with food eventually, where they just eventually get annoyed by it. That is when you really just need to revise your goals. So yeah, I mean, if I guess that's a different topic we'll probably talk about in a second. But for someone who doesn't want to track at all, the answer would be great, but track for 2 weeks and learn some things, and then you can use those habits and that information you gathered to try to move in the direction you want with your body. But if it doesn't make you happy, then you need to reconsider whether that's a realistic goal in the first place.
Yeah, and I really like your answer there, because what we have, the current state of the industry, there's like a huge movement of intuitive eating, right? There's a huge movement. Okay, just listen to your body, right? I mean, me and let's say you go to 8% body fat and you're staying there. If I listen to my body, I'm going to be 300 pounds in 2 months, right? If I listen to what my body is telling me to do, right? It's telling me to eat, right? So if I don't have a conscious self-restriction behavior or habits in place to keep that system running, I'm just going to eat. And similarly, what I kind of have with the whole intuitive eating thing is that the food environment that we're surrounded in is not supportive of intuitive eating, because you're blasted constantly by highly palatable foods, which literally you can't resist or can't stop eating. They don't send you satiety cues. And what we noticed is that people who do promote intuitive eating, I mean, usually are people who've been tracking for 7-8 years. Every single day they have a record in MyFitnessPal, and then now all of a sudden, hey, you can do this, I can do it. Of course you can do it. I mean, because you have the habit, you built it up for 8 years, right? I mean, this is something you probably notice yourself. I mean, working with bodybuilders who are on stage, and when they go off stage, they don't vary that much in terms of their foods. They can control it because of the habits they built. And how often do you recommend people going off tracking deliberately, just because it's just there's not that much point to it, because now they're in an off season, or they're just not as strict with their regime?
Great question. Yeah, and you will see a very predictable pattern with most physique competitors. In their first 1 to 3 seasons, they will really struggle with the weight rebound, and they'll gain too much, or they will try to stay too lean. And either one has their host of problems, and they often happen. Well, they'll overshoot, then try to compensate, and then overshoot and compensate. So they'll yo-yo, or they will keep themselves spending most of their off season really fat and having a crash diet, or trying to stay really too lean, not making any progress, and starting a diet in a dieted state. Then what often happens is they'll take a couple of off seasons because they burn themselves out from the sport because they never really get a break. And they regain things like sanity and satiety and hunger signals that are normal. And they get a better perspective on life and competition and how they can hopefully go hand in hand. And then they come back and then they start to see what you're talking about, where the experienced physique competitor will have a much smoother transition towards getting to a reasonable off-season body fat percentage and not letting it skyrocket, or not trying to keep it too low. But the point is that they spent 1 to 3 years being an obsessive tracker and all that stuff, and they still track when they diet down. Because like you said, habits mean nothing in the face of starvation, which is essentially what getting down to the body fat levels that a physique athlete must have to get on stage. I personally had a very similar experience, and I'm definitely not alone. And it was only in 2012, after tracking from 2006 all the way to 2012, so that's 5 or 6 years, that I started doing what would be quote unquote called intuitive eating. And the few things that I habitually have to pay attention to are basically my fruit and vegetable intake, my protein intake, and actually my water intake as well. Everything else, I just kind of let my hunger signals and my habits that I built up do their thing. And then I use my scale weight change as a surrogate for energy balance, and I can tell whether or not I'm gaining or losing at an appropriate rate. But for any kind of losing past your settling range, or even trying to gain past your settling range for those quote unquote hard gainers out there, you're going to have to track, or you'll find you'll have a great day. Let's say if you're trying to gain weight, you have a great day of eating, you have that large pizza, the next day you eat like 1,800 calories because you're so stuffed. That's very normal. And very similar things happen with dieting, in that you diet to a certain point and then all of your intuition is just telling you to eat.
Exactly.
And like you said, Mario, I think we know what happens when you have people with poor habits who intuitively eat. It's called the obesity epidemic. We have it, we have it everywhere.
Standard American diet. That's intuitive eating, right? Just eat when you're
Yeah,
hungry.
exactly. Americans are great at intuitive eating, and they're huge. So I guess if you want to get jacked, but more in your like your fat cells, then that's the way to go. Um, so yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Is that this is something that you do when it is possible. So with my physique competitors, there's a phase before they start the diet where I ask them to start tracking, because it's very stressful just to do it cold turkey after you've had a 1.5 year long off season, which we often will do, competing every other year. So that they just get used to eating at maintenance but tracking. Then we move into a deficit, and we are tracking all the way through the diet. And then there's a period after the diet's over where the tracking is still in place while we're purposely gaining weight. And the rigidity of that tracking, let's say whether we're trying to hit all 3 macros or just protein and calories, or macros with a much broader range than say 5 or 10 grams, like 20 grams, obviously changes as relevant to the goal. I want you to be very precise before we get on stage, because you're going to be competing. However, once we're off the stage, we just want to prevent you from binging and make sure that you're gaining at an appropriate rate. So it could be something like protein and calories. And then from there, that's when we start to switch to, let's just track body weight, maybe body weight and protein, just to make sure that's there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, basically you eating intuitively, but using the data from the scale to let you know when you're overdoing it or underdoing it.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, there's some structure there, and I have a bunch of rapid fire questions that I'm gonna throw at you. Very quick answers there. One thing that I just want to briefly touch on there is moving from that cut to, let's say, a lean gaining or a maintenance phase, and a lot of people, including myself, when I did it the first, second, even the third time, had a very rough time exiting the mindset to, okay, now I'm free to do whatever I want, and it usually resulted in a huge, massive amount of binges. I lost training structure in the gym. I was like, okay, why am I training now? What is going on? I just basically lost structure. And now also we go into the whole reverse dieting thing that kind of, I guess, passed a little bit now. But how would you just like kind of a cookie cutter general approach, what's a starting point when you move from a deficit to a maintenance phase? How long should that even last? And what's your kind of generic take on that? They're called maybe recovery diet, what you used to talk about before.
Yeah, sure. I think for those of you who are not necessarily running a contest prep and you want to run a cut, your plan should extend out of the cut. That way you can have that structure built in long before. And the difficult part and the reason why reverse dieting took so much hold is because reverse dieting is better than just losing all structure and binging. And it was perhaps just a overreaction and a bit too much control. But the principles are not necessarily bad. It depends on how they're implemented into what level of extremeness. So obviously, let's say you did a pretty hardcore cut and you lost, say, 20 pounds. Your maintenance calories are going to be less. Your thermic effect of food is going to be less because you're eating less food. You weigh less, so you're moving around less weight, so you're going to burn less calories. On top of that, there is a small reduction in what's called adaptive thermogenesis, where the amount of calories you'd expect to burn at the body weight you dieted to are less. And this is due to a number of factors. There is actually a reduction in metabolic rate to a small degree, anywhere up to, say, a 10% reduction, 15% reduction from what it was. And then there's a much larger reduction in what's called NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This is just your moving that isn't considered exercise. And you think, okay, well, I can just move more, then no big deal. Some of it's actually highly subconscious, and some of it's not even the movement itself, but the efficiency of your movement. So skeletal muscle efficiency goes up. The amount of calories you burn while you sleep actually reduce from dieting. So you can't really offset NEAT just by consciously doing more activity. You can add more activity, but all those other things are still in place. So it's not uncommon at all to see as high as a full 1/3 reduction from what you'd expect to burn at that body weight after especially a very severe diet if you're talking about getting on stage. So you might be starting at 210 pounds, you diet down to 180 pounds, and I'll use myself as an example, maintaining weight at over 3,000 calories in the off season, and then maintaining weight at 1,900, 2,000 calories at the end. And when you do the math, it's a clear drop in the predicted amount, and you're like, oh, it doesn't make sense. And some people think, oh, well, I'm done with the diet, I should just go back to over 3,000 calories at maintenance. That's probably not true. But what you do want to do is you want to eliminate the deficit, and it's a bit of a shot in the dark at first. Easy rule of thumb is to maybe increase your calories by 20% from where they are, right? And then just see what happens with your body weight after 2 weeks. The first week, you can expect to gain weight from glycogen, weight of food in the gut, and maybe some body fat even if you overshot. But the amount of body fat you would gain, even if you did overshoot, is going to be so minimal. And then the second week, you can start to see how your 7-day average compares to that last week's 7-day average. And at that point, you can get an idea of whether or not you're in a surplus. And then you can decide, okay, well, do I want to be in a surplus? Well, if you just got off stage and you're done with the season, yes, you want to be in a surplus. There's no reason for a bodybuilder to have striated glutes unless he's on stage. It's not great for anything except for looking really, really lean, which is probably leaner than most people even want you to look. I mean, to be honest, my significant other, my wife, Barbara, likes me at like 9%, not 4%, where I look like a Holocaust victim who lifts weights, So I think what we do with the recovery diet is we have the person with the most aggressive surplus they have throughout their entire career for about a 4 to 8 week typically period after their show. So we kind of have that. The first thing we do is we cut cardio in half or cut it out completely depending on how much they were doing in the first place. And calories come up a substantial amount to try to put them in a surplus so that they are gaining 5 to 10% of their body weight in that 4 to 8 week period, so that they are putting on, they're in an intentional surplus and gaining fat on purpose, because the most dominant mechanism for why you see that metabolic adaptation and that decrease, that adaptive thermogenesis I talked about, is the loss of body fat. Body fat is our biggest leptin signaler. So if you can put on a reasonable amount of body fat very quickly, that puts you in a place where you actually can gain muscle again, where you actually are not as nearly as obsessed with food. And you can start focusing on training again and not being so obsessive, because many of the things that we associate with eating disorders or dietary neuroses are not just in people who have problems, right, quote unquote. They're actually a result of dieting. There's a huge biological component there. In the original Minnesota semi-starvation study they did in the 40s, or the early 50s rather, that would never get past an ethics board today, 100% of the people who were extremely psychologically healthy ended up being able to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa after 6 months of being on less than half the calories they needed to maintain body weight and being forced to do exercise, not like lifting, but forced walking, basically. So I think people need to realize that all of that stuff that they're struggling with, they're struggling with it because they're struggling with it. Like if you are trying not to gain weight post-show, the reason why that's so hard is because you haven't gained weight. It's this catch-22. So the best way to do it is, instead of restricting yourself and then making this massive binge happen where you overshoot where you even started your show weight. Like for example, my first season I started at 210, and then after the post-contest binging I was 226. Yeah, contest prep made me fatter my first season. The way you avoid that is by, if I had gotten down to that 180 that I got to, or 180-ish, and then I've been like, all right, now the goal is to get to 190 in 4 weeks, and do that intentionally, not through this kind of the self-loathing binge purge cycle. Not that I was actually throwing up, but just restricting and then overeating. But to do that intentionally, and then once you get to 190 and you're 10 pounds over stage weight, now all of a sudden you have some sanity and you can actually follow a much smaller surplus without feeling out of control. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the goal of the recovery diet, and also getting into a position where you can spend more time out of the year in a reasonable surplus with a healthy level of body fat, so you can put on more muscle.
Yeah, you have a very productive lean bulk. The leaner you start, kind of find your sanity levels there. For a guy that isn't on stage weight, so let's say you just leaned out, let's say not 5% body fat, let's say somewhere at about 8% body fat, they can see veins in their abs, and their six-pack's pretty clear, no glute striation, so they're not at that level yet. Probably enough to spend about 2 to 3 weeks in maintenance. I don't see the need for more. Maybe just get your sanity back, then start working from there. Would you agree with that? I mean,
yeah, that's very reasonable. Yeah, basically, you are kind of at that point where we're trying to rush our bodybuilders to. You dieted to the 6 weeks post show, if done right, bodybuilder level.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which means you want to basically go right into a small surplus for your lean bulking phase. However, it's very difficult to know where a surplus is after you dieted. So it is probably smarter to be a little more conservative, like Mario said, which will result in you being mid-maintenance for 1 to 3 weeks tops. But yeah, there's no reason to stay in a deficit. At worst, you might be in a small deficit that first week if you were just too conservative with your jump in calories. And then if you see you've gained no weight or you lost a little bit, then you can just jump it up higher until you're gaining that at an appropriate rate of weight gain.
Yeah, and it's really good to do some, eventually if you've set up, for guys watching this, if you set up your diet properly, you would have had some refeeds or diet breaks or something like that. That's going to give you a rough idea of where that maintenance could be, of what happens when you add a little bit more calories, expected gain because of glycogen storage and things like that. So let's move on to the rapid fire, because we have a bunch of questions there as well. Then we can make time, because I know this has been already we covered so much that I know people are going to be like mind blown. So much information. So rapid fire round. These are questions that I've gathered around Facebook, questions that have been sent to me via private messaging. So number one question here, which kind of builds upon what we just spoke about, is how do you bounce back after a quote-unquote cheat day, or when you feel very, very guilty about overeating? What's your experience in that, and what would you recommend for someone who just dealt with that?
Well, the first thing to look at is this happening really frequently? Are these planned cheats, or are these unplanned? If they're unplanned and they're happening very frequently, that's when you really got to start being a little concerned. If you don't have control over it, it's a regular thing, and you're compensating, that is when you might want to start thinking about whether or not you should be dieting in the first place at all, because it's starting to develop an unhealthy relationship with food. That's case one. And other cases where maybe you've been dieting and everything's going great 6 to 8 weeks, and then damn it, you succumb to temptation, or you decided to have a little bit and it turned into a whole lot. That is very normal, and even among physique athletes, they have oopsies. So, and most of the time, the issue is not the oopsie, but then the response to the oopsie, right? One thing you can remind yourself is that most people have a fantastic physique who get on stage. If you look at them, they had maybe one or two at least problems during their prep. And it's very important to just accept the fact that you are human, and that the goal is not perfection, but rather improvement and progress, and that comes from both your mental state, not just your body. And then just get back on the ladder. I wouldn't try to compensate for it. I wouldn't do anything else. You might need to adjust your timetable, but you might be surprised with how quickly things get back in order, with one meal having probably less of an impact than you thought, even if it gets pretty out of control. If it's a regular occurrence, though, that is where you need to assess, why is your diet set up in such a way that you need to cheat on it all the time? And now, obviously, if you're dieting to stage condition, there's no way to do that without it feeling extremely restrictive. But if you're doing a non-competitor diet, you're probably trying to get too lean, or you're dieting too hard to get to where you want to go, if it's resulting in regular binges.
What I said there is someone who is, let's say, condition number 1, they might reconsider how frequently they have diet breaks. So they might introduce more frequent diet breaks, maybe experiment some refeeds, potentially experiment with, let's say, having less food restrictions for their foods that they really enjoy, get more into flexible dieting, experience why in the first place are you craving that food? Are you bored? Are you just craving it because of some emotional issues? Maybe you're sleep deprived. There's a lot of factors here involved in, let's say, what we would say, there's obviously homeostatic eating there because you want to get back to your set point, but there's also non-homeostatic eating, which is a huge thing. It's just, I mean, we know that we eat more when we're with other people. We know that we eat more when there's a lot of food variety, the whole so-called buffet effect. So look into those things. A little bit of introspection, self-awareness helps a lot. Let's move on. Next rapid-fire question. If you had to set up a bare-bone minimum program to maintain strength and muscle mass during a period of very high stress, that would allow, when I say stress, probably meaning like less time. I think that was the context. So you don't have a lot of time to train. And you could only get 2-3 sessions per week. What would approximately that program include? What would you have to hit? What rep ranges, strength, hypertrophy, what would you aim at?
Sure. I would probably hit an upper body push, an upper body pull, and then a lower body dominant lift. That could be your bare bones, where literally that's just happening twice per week. And still there, Mario? Did you get all that?
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll just keep talking. And you can do that twice per week with a heavy and a moderate rep range each, and just try to progress them if you can, or just try to maintain loads if you're looking at maintenance. On a semi-tangent, I had to do this for a period of my data collection or my PhD, and I actually realized that I had time to train regularly, but just way less time than I thought. And I was doing 30 to 45 minute workouts 6 days per week, and that was much better than trying to do 2 or 3. Actually, I was doing like 3 2.5 hour workouts per week. Was beating me down, because I was doing like squat, bench, deadlift twice per week, and really wrecking myself twice
So
per week.
the
But when
quality of the volume went down when you had to cram it all up in 2 sessions, right?
Yeah, but when I would just do 2 exercises per day, literally 3 sets each, and spread it out over the week, all of a sudden it was much better, and I was actually progressing. So,
Awesome.
yeah, you might want to consider whether or not you truly can't get to the gym even for 45 minutes more frequently.
Yeah, and we have a lot of benefits, and I just recently spoke with Menno Hensmans. He's reminded of the correlation between, okay, if you exercise, you're going to sleep better, you have more optimal performance in your general life. So you have a lot of benefits from exercise in general, kind of, even if you're an extreme knowledge worker, even if you're super involved in knowledge work, you still would benefit from just using that exercise session as meditation or something, just to get away from
Mm.
work, to get some good ideas, to get back at it. I mean, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, right? So one is better than zero. So get out of the all or nothing mindset. That's kind of the, I guess, what we would say here. One thing I guess we covered here, one rapid question was how would you approach an advanced client who wants to get rid of the stress of neurotic calorie and macro tracking and obsessive eating habits, and how would you introduce that individual to more flexible, relaxed approach? I think we covered that a little bit. I guess
Mm.
it's more of a mindset issue, right?
Yeah, and it's in stages. I think is the key. Yeah, a lot of the times, someone who's advanced, they've achieved a very high level of performance, or they've achieved something impressive that they're proud of through doing it in a probably a pretty restrictive way. So that is already they've been rewarded by that behavior. So it'd be scary to do things differently. Kind of that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they've probably also gotten themselves relatively well adapted to it socially and emotionally, so it doesn't bother them that much to do it. However, if it does bother them to the point where they're seeking someone out or deciding or trying to change, uh, then it's a matter of, okay, it's probably something that would be good for their mental health to change, but it doesn't need to happen overnight. So perhaps if they are simply on a very strict meal plan, they just start swapping out different foods to start. So just increasing food variety to first start, and then once they see that it hasn't negatively affected them in any way, that they'll have some more buy-in. Then you can move towards a bit more of a quote unquote if it fits your macros approach towards food variety. It has a lot more free reign, and they may not even actually take advantage of all that free reign. They would probably keep things relatively similar. And then
Yeah.
from there, once they get a little more attached to the numbers that resulted in the foods that they were eating before, I'm making some assumptions about how rigid they were, or maybe they were always just doing very strict macros. That's when you can move towards, say, protein and calories or broader ranges. And then probably, again, they will find that didn't result in anything negative, that they were still staying in roughly the middle of the range once they got adapted to it. And it's kind of that small change, uh, fear, acceptance, and then doing it again, and kind of having to repeat that process in
Seems
small
like it
stages.
goes full circle. It's kind of like that paradox of availability. Once you know that you can do it, you don't really want to do it anymore. So it's almost like, okay, I have this chocolate bar here. I don't want to eat it anymore. But when it's outside of the house, you crave it. Seems like it's
Exactly.
a little bit like that. Okay, next rapid one is a viewer just asked your current opinion on utilizing intermittent fasting based on the recent IF studies that came out. There's two ones that I know of, and kind of how would you practically apply it to just try it out, and what would be your kind of advice there?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, there was a two intermittent fasting studies that have come out recently. One had a 4-hour eating period, and the other one had an 8-hour feeding period, which is much more similar to the probably what everyone's familiar with from Martin Berkhan intermittent fasting approach from Lean Gains. The 4-hour one didn't perform very well, but it didn't do too bad. And the 8-hour one did pretty well. I think it kicked some ass in that study. So I think this confirms probably what we already knew, is that you have a fair bit of flexibility with your eating schedule. And when you think about it, an eight hour feast, 16-hour fast isn't that crazy compared to what we do in normal life. If you sleep 8 hours, that just kind of
Yeah.
means your food is just back shifted. Um, However, I would still caution to people that it doesn't necessarily mean it's better or optimal or the best. It gives you more flexibility. It may be a useful strategy for some people to reduce their dietary intake, and we should probably also balance it with some of the data we have on protein dosing that may or may not, we don't have a lot of longitudinal data, optimize the accrual of muscle mass. And I would remind people that with a 8-hour feeding window, that doesn't mean you can't have any food outside of it, period. It doesn't break the system or anything like that. There aren't really any rules to this. Um, I would advise people that even if they have a system where they um, have an intermittent fasting kind of schedule where they eat the majority of their food at dinner and before bed, that you can still have small servings of protein to throughout the rest of the day. I actually eat similarly to intermittent fasting in that my breakfast is typically a Quest bar, and then I don't eat again till 11:30 noon for lunch, and that lunch is typically 800 calories or less. So now I've only had 1,000 calories by lunchtime, and then I have a another Quest bar or a small protein serving a couple hours before I train, and then I have a post-workout protein shake, and then a huge dinner. That's just what I like to do. But you'll also notice that I had like 4 or 5 protein servings
Yeah.
um, and spread out. So I have taken advantage of the principles from both that serve me as an individual well, allowing me to eat in a pattern that I don't feel restricted, so that life is less stressful, and that I can still modulate my change in body weight. I can still gain weight if I just simply make my dinners even bigger, or if I want to add a little more to my lunch. And I can also lose weight just by modulating my lunch a little more, or simply not having a second serving at dinner. And I don't feel that restricted until I do. And likewise, I'm also hopefully optimizing what we currently know about protein spread, and spreading out my total intake over multiple meals that are reasonably spread apart, so that I can get the maximum area under the curve of muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah, and that's well said. I mean, you have to find something that works for you, and we do have some emerging research even saying that before bed, some protein is probably a good idea for those interested in maximizing body composition. Of course, I know that a lot of, let's say, hardcore extremists, the intermittent fasting would be, okay, if you eat 1 calorie, you're not fasting anymore. That's great. I guess different goals as well. I mean, someone who is less interested in body composition, they have a lot more leeway. They can just play around with that any way they want. Eating 1 or 2 meals per day, sure, but we can say with a fair deal of certainty that it doesn't hurt to have a little bit more protein servings. We don't know exactly the ideal number, but if I would have to bet on more servings versus less, I would bet on more to have a more long-term benefit. Um, Moving forward, this is, I guess, before we move to trivia, we have only a couple of trivia. How to mentally deal with an injury and come back? Because I know you've had to deal with a few injuries yourself, and this is a question that I always get a lot. I mean, it seems again that black and white. I get it, a little bit of shoulder injury, or I can't go to the gym anymore, right? Or how do you mentally deal with that?
That's a good question. So, for perspective for the listeners, I've had basically two different types of injuries that are. I haven't had a whole lot of injuries, but I had a hamstring tear in 2009, which put me on the floor, literally crawling to the phone to get help. And then more recently, I have been diagnosed with FAI, which is femoral acetabular impingement, which just means that I get bone-on-bone contact at the very deepest portion of a squat because of the structure of my hips. It's not something I can do mobility work or physio away. It's literally a bone. And the only way to deal with it is to eventually either get surgery or just choose exercises which don't put me in that position. So if I wanted to give up powerlifting and not do low bar squats and only front squat, I'd be fine. If I just decided I just want to do bodybuilding, and if I wasn't me, that would be fine. But I love powerlifting, so I'm probably going to get I'm going to get surgery. So I'll go back to 2009. The way you deal with an acute injury, or the way I have found is successful for most people, is to really focus on what you can do, not on what you can't. And it may sound a little extreme, but I was literally 2 days later in the gym on crutches doing a machine upper body workout. And I knew there was a cross education effect to where one limb can get strength from the other. And I was doing leg press on my right leg extension, and leg curl. I never did anything I wasn't supposed to. I had a rehabilitation plan from my doctor. So for my injured leg, I did exactly what I was supposed to do in terms of waiting until I was supposed to stretch and doing stability and balance work, not waiting to walk at a certain speed or an incline before later, and then eventually jogging and eventually running. And I had regular checkups. So I definitely did exactly what the specialist told me to do. But I also made it my job to follow that rehab plan. Like I was focusing on the recovery as something that would be very to keep my mind space focused. And I was doing everything else I possibly could. I was still seated dumbbell pressing, bench press once I could plant my leg without issues. And before that, I was doing machine work. And I literally competed 5 weeks after that hamstring tear, and no one knew that I had a hamstring tear. And then I want to say 12 weeks after it, I was squatting and about 90% of the weight I was before. And about 4 months later, I had begun deadlifting and got about 90% up to where I was. So I had a better recovery than my doctor thought possible. And she told me that if she didn't have the MRI, she wouldn't believe that I'd torn my hamstring. So I think that is not that I'm like Wolverine. I think it's because I just followed exactly what I was told to do. and I did everything in my power I could, and I focused on it, and I was very proactive rather than being reactive. And I think we have to remember that most of us who lift weights, um, that is our therapy. It's part of our lives. It's what we do. We get a physiological response from it that helps our mood stay there. So not only is injury in itself painful, depressing, and stressful, but then if you also take away training, that's like taking an anchor up in the middle of a storm, you know.
Yeah.
So I tell people to definitely keep your anchor in the storm. Focus on what you can do, not what you can't. Um, and the FAI that I have now, or those nagging injuries that never go away that you have to train around or that you can't really change or deal with, those are the ones that, in my opinion, are harder, require a little more acceptance. And some people, you may not even be in the financial position to get surgery, or there may not be a surgery that will reliably improve it. And that's when the hard decisions have to happen. I gave up Olympic lifting because of my hip. And fortunately, I had other things to fall back on, whether that was bodybuilding or powerlifting, and then eventually powerlifting stopped being an option. So I think, and now I'm getting surgery. So I think a lot of that has to do with acceptance, and then also, as my colleague Berto likes to say, diversifying your happiness portfolio. Finding other things that you can do. Hopefully you enjoy bodybuilding because that's the easiest thing to do. In terms of, you just need to be creative. I've seen incredible physiques developed by occluded leg extensions and partial range of motion leg press, and you'd think they must be doing ass to grass squats with 500 pounds per reps when they're actually doing 4 sets of 20 with 30 pounds on leg extensions with a knee wrap around their legs. So yeah, bodybuilding hypertrophy really is just about putting progressive stress on muscle tissue over time, and there's many ways to do that. And it doesn't really matter what's optimal once you have an injury. You have to focus on what you can do, not on what you can't.
Awesome. Yeah, that is so powerful. As you said there, it's just focusing on the circle of your influence versus circle of something where you're just a victim or you just can't control it. And it's really about your attitude, where you be creative a little bit more and just have that solution-oriented mindset versus just like, okay, I give up, or I'm just a victim of this, or use it as an excuse, which you've, I mean, given yourself is a really good example of that. That is amazing, and I'm sure that a lot of people dealing with those nagging little pains there will be able to get a lot of value from that. Two questions from folks that we know, both of us. One here we have from Mike Zourdos, and he says, "Do you have any music coming out soon?"
Oh yeah, dropping the new mixtape, 2018. It's going to be called Quelly Returns, and I'll be featuring some tracks from popular hip hop artists. Yeah.
And one we have from Andy Morgan from Everybody, he says, "How do you manage to maintain your sex appeal in middle ages so well?"
Drugs, just heaps and heaps of drugs. And are we still recording? Are we still recording right now?
Gonna
I
have to
think,
cut this out.
yeah, we're gonna have to edit this out. I'm supposed to be known as drug free. Um, yeah, no, actually the cool thing about lifting, and people realize this once they get older, is that it takes a really long damn time, even with half decent genetics in natural bodybuilding, to build a good physique. And if you're patient and you stick with it, you find that the point at which you have a little more emotional maturity, a little more self-acceptance, is also the point when your physique actually starts to look the way you wished it always had. Um, so you do eventually get the payoff. I think my body is probably, I have the most muscle mass that I've had ever in my life now at 33. I don't know if that'll also be true when I'm 43 or 53, but based on what I've seen with Jeff Alberts, I certainly don't think I'm anywhere near my peak. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, Jeff is amazing, and I'm gonna link to the 3DMJ channel where they can watch videos from Berto, from you, from Andrea, from all of you guys, from Brad as well. There's a lot of value there as well. I'm probably gonna get Berto here as well to talk with him a little bit about fat loss and getting shredded. He's the prime example of can get shredded as a natural, so that in the process of setting that up. Um, Aside from that, I mean, a huge thank you here for you. I mean, we've been going for quite a bit of time now. We covered so much here. I think people will be mind blown, as I said, from the value. Let's just give them, I guess, a conclusion where people can find you. What are you currently working on? We're going to link to your books as well. Some people ask when is the next update coming for those books, so maybe we can get into that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So I got a handful of things working on. We'll start with the books since you just mentioned them. For those who don't know, I co-authored along with Andy Morgan, the guy who just made fun of my age, and Andrew Valdez, one of my co-coaches at 3DMJ. We wrote the Muscle and Strength Nutrition and Training Pyramids. These are books based off of the YouTube series I did in 2013 and 2015, if I remember correctly. And they basically cover everything you could possibly want to know from the ground up, hence the pyramid, of setting up your nutrition and training priorities and programming for both. And these are available in ebook form at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com, and we are planning to release a second edition sometime in the second, third, or fourth quarter of next year, if all goes according to plan. Other cool things, anyone who's interested in information or community support for natural bodybuilding or even coaching, check out 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel, which you've got linked, I'm sure.
Yeah, everything is going to be linked there in
awesome.
the description,
yeah,
so you guys can just don't have to write down the links, the books as well.
Yeah. And then also, if anyone is struggling to make objective decisions on their own about their nutrition and they happen to be a Apple user, we have a very cool app that I'm the nutrition consultant for called Fit Genie. It's a free app that helps determine what your macronutrients are, and then based on what your goals are, it helps you adjust them using an intelligent algorithm over time. So definitely check out fitgenieapp.com and give that a shot. It's free. It's cool stuff. And that can be a great way to help you just not get in your own way with nutrition and focus on other things.
Awesome, especially for those guys. I mean, you guys watching this self-coaching, a huge idea just to be a little bit more objective. Once again, thanks, Eric, for being here. Ton of value. Everything is going to be linked in the description below as well for you guys. Check out 3DMJ channel. Check out the books. Highly endorsed by this channel, by me, whatever. I mean, stuff we talked about here, a lot of it is even more in-depth inside of the books as well, so you can get more templates, more examples. If you weren't sure about certain concepts, and in general, if it's going to help you get as shredded and as big as you want, so definitely check out that. Aside from that, thank you all for watching, for sticking with us for such a long time. It was pleasurable for you as much as for us to talk a bit about getting big and jacked and shredded. And have a good rest of your day, time, wherever you are. And yeah, once again, thanks, Eric. And yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Honored to be on.